Listen closely, because what you are about to hear challenges a belief many men carry silently for years. There is a hidden agreement that often forms inside marriage without ever being spoken out loud. It feels like responsibility. It feels like love. But in practice, it slowly turns into exhaustion. This is what we can call the unhappiness contract. It is the belief that if you sacrifice enough, adjust enough, and endure enough pressure, you will eventually create peace in your relationship. You start thinking that every demand, every complaint, and every emotional shift from your partner is something you are supposed to fix. Over time, you begin to see yourself as the solution to a problem that never truly belonged to you in the first place. And this is where many men get trapped mentally, not because they lack strength, but because they are wired to provide, to fix, and to stabilize what feels unstable. But emotional dissatisfaction is not a mechanical issue you can simply solve with effort, money, or obedience. It is internal, complex, and often not fully dependent on external circumstances. When a man tries to solve it anyway, he slowly starts losing balance in his own life. I want to be clear here. This is not about mutual cooperation or healthy compromise between two people. It is about situations where one person starts feeling responsible for carrying the emotional weight of the entire relationship alone. In clinical observation and real-world experience, this pattern often leads to stress, resentment, and a gradual erosion of self-respect over time. The danger is not care or support. The danger is self-erasure in the name of keeping peace. And so, in this discussion, we are going to break down the most common situations where this pattern shows up in practical life. Not as absolute truths, but as warning signs many men recognize too late. Now, before we go further, understand this clearly. If both partners openly agree on life decisions with shared values and mutual respect, there is no issue at all. The problem begins when agreement is driven by pressure, guilt, or the belief that refusal will destroy peace. That is where imbalance starts to form. Let's begin with the first real-life situation where this pattern often appears. Number 10, moving to another city solely to satisfy emotional dissatisfaction. In many relationships, this demand shows up as a belief that a change of location will fix internal discomfort. It may involve leaving a familiar town, moving closer to family, or chasing a bigger city with the hope of starting fresh. At first, it can sound logical. A new environment, a new beginning. But in reality, geography rarely resolves emotional instability. What often happens instead is a new set of pressures layered on top of existing ones. There is disruption in career structure, financial adjustment, and loss of familiarity that once provided stability. From a psychological stress perspective, constant major life disruption can keep the mind in a state of ongoing tension and uncertainty. And over time, that can reduce focus, clarity, and personal grounding. Emotionally, it can also create a feeling of being carried by external demands rather than living by internal direction. And practically, relocation does not guarantee resolution of dissatisfaction, because unresolved emotional patterns often travel with the person, not the place. Now, number 9, agreeing to take on a high responsibility pet decision, such as getting a dog, despite clear hesitation. This situation often arises when emotional appeal or family pressure overrides practical concerns. It may be framed around companionship, children's happiness, or creating a warmer home environment. On the surface, it feels harmless, but responsibility does not end at the emotional excitement phase. Daily care, costs, time commitment, and long-term obligations become part of reality very quickly. When one partner ends up carrying most of that responsibility, frustration often builds silently over time, not because of the animal itself, but because of imbalance in ownership of the decision. In many cases, this becomes an unspoken source of stress inside the household routine. And number 8, agreeing to one partner leaving their job primarily due to emotional dissatisfaction or boredom, without considering long-term financial structure. This is often presented as a solution to unhappiness or lack of fulfillment. But removing structure without replacing it with purpose can sometimes increase instability instead of reducing it. Work provides routine, identity, and external engagement with the world. When that structure disappears suddenly, the household dynamic shifts significantly. Financial pressure may increase on the working partner, and emotional dependence can also intensify. Over time, this can create additional tension instead of solving the original concern. The key issue here is not whether someone should or should not work. It is whether the decision is mutual, stable, and aligned with long-term planning rather than reactive emotional escape. And this is where many relationships quietly begin to feel imbalance without either person fully realizing it at first. We will continue from here in the next part. Now, moving forward, we continue examining the next patterns where imbalance often develops inside relationships when decisions are made under pressure rather than mutual clarity. Number 7, taking over or constantly being pulled into everyday errands like grocery shopping, only to face repeated criticism or dissatisfaction with the outcome. On the surface, this looks like simple household teamwork. But in many cases, it slowly becomes a cycle where responsibility is shifted, yet accountability is still used as a source of tension. A person may try to help, try to contribute, and try to reduce conflict by stepping in more often. However, instead of creating peace, the effort can sometimes lead to more correction, more dissatisfaction, and more scrutiny over small details. This creates a subtle psychological pattern. The more effort you put in, the more you may feel evaluated rather than appreciated. Over time, that can lead to hesitation, emotional withdrawal, or the feeling that no action is ever fully correct. From a behavioral standpoint, repeated negative reinforcement can reduce motivation to participate in shared tasks. Not because of unwillingness, but because of learned expectation that effort leads to criticism rather than resolution. And practically, it can turn ordinary daily responsibilities into emotionally charged interactions instead of neutral cooperation. Now, number 6, agreeing to an open relationship arrangement under emotional pressure or fear of losing the relationship. This is a deeply sensitive area, and it is often framed in emotionally persuasive language, such as, "If you care, you will agree," or "This will make things better for us." But underneath that framing, there is often a mismatch in emotional needs and boundaries. From a psychological stability perspective, many individuals experience difficulty when core expectations of exclusivity and commitment are suddenly altered under pressure. It can create emotional insecurity, confusion, and long-term instability in trust dynamics. When agreement is not fully mutual and internally aligned, the emotional cost tends to rise significantly over time. This is why clarity, consent, and genuine alignment matter more than persuasion in such decisions. Without that, the relationship structure itself can begin to feel unstable for both people involved. Now, number 5, agreeing to a permanent medical decision, such as a vasectomy, under coercion or emotional pressure, rather than full personal agreement. This is not just a physical decision. It is also a deeply psychological one, because it involves long-term bodily autonomy. When someone feels pushed into irreversible change without complete willingness, it can create lasting internal resentment. Even if the decision is medically safe and logically explained, the emotional foundation still matters, because decisions tied to identity, autonomy, and future planning must come from internal agreement, not external pressure. Otherwise, the emotional residue of that pressure can remain long after the procedure itself. Now, number 4, agreeing to have another child primarily to resolve emotional distance or relationship dissatisfaction. In many situations, the idea of having a baby is emotionally linked to renewal, bonding, or fixing what feels broken. But in reality, a child introduces significant new responsibilities, financial demands, and long-term emotional pressure. If the underlying relationship issues are not resolved beforehand, they often continue afterward, now layered with additional stress. This can intensify exhaustion rather than resolve emotional gaps. A child should not be used as a solution to emotional imbalance between partners. Because the responsibility of raising a child requires stability first, not as a tool to create stability. Now, number 3, constant home renovation or remodeling projects driven by emotional dissatisfaction rather than practical necessity. At first, these projects may seem like improvement, creativity, or renewal of environment. But when they become continuous and unstructured, they can introduce ongoing financial strain and lack of completion in the home environment. From a psychological standpoint, constant external changes can sometimes reflect internal restlessness. Instead of addressing internal discomfort directly, attention shifts toward modifying surroundings repeatedly. Over time, this can create a cycle of unfinished projects, financial pressure, and ongoing disruption in daily life stability. And in practical terms, it often places consistent demands on time, energy, and resources without delivering lasting emotional resolution. We will continue with the final section in part 3. Now we continue into the final set of situations where these patterns often become even more direct, and where the emotional and practical consequences tend to feel heavier over time. Number 2, agreeing to reduce or eliminate normal, responsible personal habits such as moderate drinking when it is not actually causing harm or dysfunction. In many relationships, this type of demand is framed as concern, improvement, or encouragement toward better behavior. But in some cases, it goes beyond health or responsibility and becomes a subtle attempt to control personal comfort routines. From a psychological perspective, when a harmless coping habit is restricted without clear necessity, it can create an internal feeling of restriction and tension. Not because the habit itself is essential, but because the decision feels externally imposed rather than personally chosen. Over time, this can build quiet resentment, especially when the behavior was already balanced and responsible. Because autonomy matters not only in major life decisions, but also in small personal freedoms. When those are repeatedly questioned, it can affect overall sense of independence within the relationship. Now, number 1, agreeing to go to counseling under the assumption that one partner is entirely responsible for the emotional problems in the relationship. Counseling itself is not the issue here. In fact, structured therapy can be useful when both individuals participate with openness and mutual accountability. The concern arises when it is framed as a one-sided correction process, where one person is positioned as the problem and the other as the solution. This can create emotional resistance, defensiveness, and feelings of being judged rather than supported. From a psychological standpoint, labeling one partner as fundamentally defective can intensify shame and reduce open communication, because effective therapy works best when both individuals examine patterns together, not when one is assigned all responsibility for the situation. When that balance is missing, the process can feel more like evaluation than healing. Now, stepping back from all 10 situations, the central theme becomes clearer. These examples are not about rejecting compromise or refusing all responsibility in a relationship. They are about recognizing when decisions are made under pressure instead of genuine agreement. Because healthy relationships are built on mutual choice, not emotional coercion. When choices are forced through guilt, pressure, or fear of conflict, the internal cost often builds silently over time. Now, there are 3 core principles that can help reset this pattern when it appears. First, refusal with clarity. When a demand does not align with your values, stability, or long-term well-being, it is important to communicate that clearly and calmly without getting pulled into endless justification. The goal is not argument, it is boundary setting. Second, rebuilding personal focus. Energy that was previously spent trying to manage emotional reactions should be redirected toward physical health, career stability, personal discipline, and inner calm. This helps restore internal balance and reduces dependency on external approval. Third, intentional action instead of obligation. If you choose to do something, it should come from personal values and willingness, not from pressure or fear of consequences. Because actions taken freely strengthen identity, while actions taken under coercion slowly weaken it. And at the core of all of this is one simple truth. A person cannot be fully responsible for fixing another person's internal emotional world. Support is possible, understanding is possible, cooperation is possible, but replacement of internal fulfillment through external sacrifice is not sustainable in the long term. The goal is not distance or conflict. The goal is balance, clarity, and mutual responsibility. And when that balance exists, both individuals can maintain their dignity, their stability, and their peace without losing themselves in the process. Now, as we bring this conversation to its conclusion, I want you to pause for a moment and reflect on something very simple, yet very important. Think about the energy you have been spending over the years trying to maintain peace by meeting expectations that never seem to end. Think about the times you agreed to something, not because it felt right, but because you believed it would finally stop the tension. And then ask yourself honestly, did it actually solve the problem, or did it only delay the next one? Because in most cases, what happens is not resolution, but repetition. The cycle continues, only now with more pressure, more expectation, and less internal clarity. This is why the first and most important step moving forward is not confrontation and it is not withdrawal. It is clarity. Clarity about what is yours to carry and what is not. Clarity about your values, your limits, and your non negotiables. And most importantly, clarity about the fact that peace built on self sacrifice without balance is not real peace. It is temporary compliance. Now, from a practical standpoint, this means learning how to respond differently when pressure appears. Not with anger, not with defensiveness, but with calm, grounded certainty. When a demand is presented that does not align with your stability, your direction, or your principles, your response must reflect internal alignment. It can be simple, it can be direct, and it must be consistent. Because consistency is what breaks cycles, not intensity. Over time, this changes the dynamic. Not because you are trying to control the other person, but because you are no longer participating in patterns that undermine your own stability. Now, at the same time, it is equally important to redirect your focus inward. Strength, both physical and mental, plays a significant role in how you experience and respond to pressure. When your body is strong, your mind tends to follow with more resilience. When your daily structure is clear, your tolerance for unnecessary chaos becomes lower. And when your sense of purpose is grounded in your own actions, external demands lose their ability to dictate your direction. This is not about becoming distant. It is about becoming stable. Because stability is what allows you to engage in a relationship without losing yourself inside it. Now, there is one final principle that must be understood clearly. If you choose to do something, let it be because it aligns with your values, not because you are trying to earn peace. Peace is not something you negotiate for by giving pieces of yourself away. It is something you build by standing on what you know is right for you, while still respecting the other person. And that distinction matters more than most people realize. Because once your actions come from choice instead of pressure, the entire emotional dynamic begins to shift. You are no longer reacting. You are deciding. And that is where control returns to your life in a healthy and sustainable way. Now, I want to leave you with this. You are not responsible for filling emotional gaps that exist within another person. You are not responsible for solving dissatisfaction that was not created by your actions. And you are not required to abandon your stability in order to maintain a relationship. What you are responsible for is your direction, your integrity, and your ability to maintain balance in your own life. And when you do that consistently, something important happens. You begin to feel grounded again. You begin to think more clearly. And you begin to operate from a place of strength rather than reaction. So as you move forward from here, make one simple commitment to yourself. Choose one pattern from this discussion that you recognize in your own life, and decide that from this point on, you will handle it differently. Not aggressively, not emotionally, but deliberately, because small, consistent changes in behavior are what create long-term stability, not sudden, dramatic reactions. Now, if this discussion gave you a clearer perspective, I want you to take a moment and engage with it. Share one situation where you realized you were saying yes when you should have paused. Because awareness is always the first step toward change. And if you believe this message could help someone else understand their situation more clearly, pass it along. These conversations matter more than most people think. And finally, if you want more discussions that focus on clarity, structure, and long-term well-being, make sure you stay connected. Because this is not about short-term advice. This is about building a stable, grounded way of living over time. I'm Dr. Jocelyn, and I look forward to continuing this conversation with you.